So today, I want to offer some thoughts about what I'm going to start out calling two paths that we may follow in our practice. And these two paths, the names of these two paths are not original to me. I think I first heard them from Reverend Kokyo Henkel, a good friend of all of us. The two paths are the path of healing and the path of liberation. And very often, it seems to me, people who come to practice in the places that I've practiced, for some length of time, they seem to kind of be drawn by one of these two paths, by the promise of healing or the promise of some kind of once and for all liberation from suffering, the bolt from the blue that's going to resolve everything. And we don't usually identify two paths, but those seem to be kind of two common orientations that people may have. So it depends in part on, the community and the teachers and the emphasis of a particular place as to what people gravitate towards and what develops in response to people's aspirations. So I want to say a little bit about the two paths. And at least the emphasis seems different. What do you hear when you hear the word healing? What comes up for you? What's the first thought?
Acceptance.
Acceptance.
Relief.
Relief.
What did you say?
Wounds. Wounds. Does anybody have a kind of embodied response? Like, I feel pain, the need to resolve pain, or to at least find a place of acceptance and ease with it. What about liberation? What does that evoke?
Happiness.
Happiness.
Relief.
Relief.
Fear.
Fear. You say a little bit more about fear? Whoever said that? Yes.
Okay. Fear to be liberated.
Fear of liberation. Oh, good. We'll come back to that.
Serenity.
Freedom.
Serenity, freedom.
Joy.
Joy.
Letting go. Letting go.
Letting go.
Lightness.
Lightness. Very good. That's interesting. That was the more responses to that word. Excellent. Very good. Does one lead to another? Does one come first in your minds? There's no wrong or right answer here. Just curious as to what you think. There will not be a test.
I think healing tends to come first, but liberation can be a gift that happens anytime, So I feel like healing makes you more receptive to the chance of it.
Healing makes you more receptive to the chance for liberation. Thank you very much. Anyone want to add anything?
Why can't they happen together?
Why can't they happen together? Why indeed? So, should we think of them as stages, which is kind of what we've been, exploring a little bit? But wait, Zen has no stages. Or does it? So where I'm practicing now as the guiding teacher at Austin Zen Center, we often encounter new people who come in with some experience of practices or modalities that are aimed at well-being and maybe at a form of healing. We have a lot of people who practice yoga and become curious about Zen meditation, maybe because they've done some sitting as part of their yoga practice. People sometimes have experienced forest bathing or sound bathing, other forms of meditation, and they're a little bit surprised by our Zazen practice. I don't know if this is true here, but when they get Zazen instruction, they're like, is that it? tell me what I'm really supposed to be doing. This is the beginner's practice, right? So this is why we say no stages. So our Zazen practice, we don't, at least at Austin, do much in the way of guided meditation. We don't offer visualizations. I remember one person stalking out of Zazen instruction that I offered in Chapel Hill, where I used to practice, because I wasn't offering her a mantra or a visualization. She said, well, this is useless. She left. No toys, right? No toys. And then on the other hand, some people gravitate to Zendo practice right away, right? They want to just sit in semi-darkness, in silence, facing the wall, and nobody's going to talk to them, and that's just great. And that's how they're confronting their suffering. Right? Other people come in, not even through the Zendo at all, or through meditation instruction, but they come for our affinity groups. That's their gate. And right now, our affinity groups are Queer Dharma, and we have a women's circle. We have a recovery group, and we also have a Dharma Punks group that just meets in our space, that has for a long time. Then we have the philosophically minded among us. And often these folks have read a lot about Buddhism, and they want to pursue an understanding of, what seems to be an efficacious path, the straight path of Zen to the end of suffering. And so they're after enlightenment, promise of enlightenment. And some of them confidently assert that Buddhism isn't a religion. It's not a religion. It's more like a philosophy or a science of the mind, or at least it's logical. It makes sense. And that's how they enter this path, from, without the trappings of the religion maybe that they grew up in. And then they experience service like we had this morning, and they're like, uh-oh, it's a religion. All right, so lots of categories and concepts. Oh, somebody. Okay. I never know where to look when I'm here, because there's a camera in front of me and there are people all around me, and then there's me. I'm always surprised at what I look like. Sometimes the people who come in through one of these various, gateways find themselves coming for healing and staying for liberation, or hoping for liberation through meditation and realizing they need healing. So I think these are like a kind of helix. These paths actually entwine and work together. So as Kokyo, our friend Reverend Kokyo notes, and I've already mentioned, some of the practices that are embodied practices have sometimes been stripped out of Buddhism, even though, like the mindfulness movement in our culture, in fact, they've been corporatized and commodified, right? And turned into, ways to be more productive, right? Mindful, or meditation for stress reduction, specifically for that purpose, or for arousing joy, or at least contentment. These were things that we mentioned. Or for feeling good in our bodies, relaxing our minds. So it's a lot about stress, kind of dealing with our stress. And more seriously, meeting and resolving trauma for many people. And so, Kokyo mentions yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong, all as practices that, kind of aligned with these modalities to facilitate such states. And various kinds of therapy, of course, are also the path of healing, as we, often encounter it. So are practices that work with posture, breathing, enjoying the breath, that return us to our physical selves and encouraging a relaxed body and body awareness. And in these practices, for example, say following the breath, which is also part of our Zazen, the emphasis is not so much on enjoyment, although that may arise, but, on stabilization, on kind of letting go of our usual thinking, busy minds and returning to our immediate experience. And this is sometimes called shamatha practice, right? Stabilizing the mind and body And this can foster acceptance of whatever is happening, but with relaxation and cultivating the ability to be present and maybe even equanimous. If we can't enjoy the experience of the present moment, we are encouraged to accept and embrace it. Oops, excuse me. Lost control here. To embrace and to accept our experience without manipulation. Being completely with our thoughts, our feelings, our discomfort, our resistance, and letting them come and also letting them go. These were all things that you all mentioned earlier. Reverend Kokyo follows a teacher, a Tibetan teacher named Tsoknyi Rinpoche, and he calls this kind of practice, which is in a way a preliminary practice, it can be thought of that, as grounding in the body, very simply, grounding in the body. And from this stability, no running away, just staying and shaking hands, as he says, with your own monsters and the monsters of others. He says you can practice then from that stable place, insight or vipassana meditation, right? And this insight reveals what he calls the warm heart, the default heart of humans. And here's a quote from his website. He has an entire kind of course about how to do this. He gives this warm heart the name Essence Love. Essence Love. Now, I would have run screaming from the Zendo if somebody had said that to me. No. I'm here to face my grumpiness. But anyway, this is what he calls it. And it speaks to many people. It now speaks to me. Essence Love. What lives under our wounding and fears, he says. We learn to befriend our beautiful monsters. That speaks to me. Our challenging emotional patterns and shadows, and it helps us to create a healthy relationship between the mind and the feeling world. These are his words. And through this, we can discover what he says is our birthright, a natural well-being. That's the end of the quote. And so then we integrate this clear mind, right? Not the everyday discriminating mind, but through settling our clear mind, the big mind that Suzuki Roshi talks about, we learn to recognize this natural clarity. This is actually the way we naturally are. This is Buddha nature, allowing insight and wisdom to arise. So that clarity of mind is what allows insight and wisdom, and of course, compassion. Now, Zazen, as you may already know or have been taught or understand intuitively, combines shamatha and insight into one thing. Right? We don't kind of say, gotta do shamatha first, and then you're going to get the insight. It's like, just sit down, just sit down and see. Right? So that's our practice. Now, in Zen, I just quoted a Tibetan teacher. In Zen, we don't find much of this kind of talk about, essence love. He provides us a lot of suggestions for practice, for how to practice, including how to do Zazen, right? Zazen instruction. And then there are many fascicles or chapters in the Shobogenzo, like the 8 qualities of a great being, or the Bodhisattva's 4 methods of guidance, all of which are practice instruction. And we get some direction, of course, also from the teachings of the Buddha himself, such as following the Eightfold Path that reduces suffering, that leads to the end of suffering, as well as specific practices such as metta practice, which I'm sure many of you do or are familiar with, friendliness or loving kindness to the self and to all others, to all beings. So the path of liberation, I'll say a few words about that. What are we liberating ourselves from? Or what are we liberating others from? I like Reb's, Tenshin Roshi's statement. He says, I'm not here to reduce your suffering. I'm here to liberate you from your suffering. So liberation from suffering, liberation from grasping, from clinging, from belief in an independent self. Maybe that's where the fear comes in, the fear of liberation. Sometimes people say, I'm afraid if I lose myself, I won't be able to function. I won't know who I am. I heard the phrase, which I think comes from psychological insights and Western psychological practices, the wound of separation. So there's the healing. That's part of liberation. That's how I think we can look at this healing and this liberation as not different, ultimately not different. To heal the wound of separation takes courage. It takes a lot of courage. So a lot of the Zen teachings sound like the quick path, right? Cutting through delusion, finding the freedom, though, of spacious awareness that is our true nature, boundlessness. Now, for some, the promise of an end to suffering, the promise of transcending or eliminating suffering, as some see it, is like some kind of superhuman state, and that attracts some of our younger people especially. They're looking for the kind of end of suffering that means I don't have to feel anything anymore, good or bad. It's a kind of grand spiritual bypassing. Right? I'm going to be beyond suffering, which they think is beyond any kind of feeling, or being able to transcend whatever they're feeling. And again, this is I'm not criticizing anyone here, just some of what I hear from people who come, what they are looking for. Some people think, oh, I could be like Buddha and remember my past lives. That would be so cool. Or I could read the minds of others. We have a lot of admonitions about not grasping for spiritual powers, but some people, that's what they want. Right? Other unusual powers. Right? People kind of secretly hope for this. But the hoping not to, the end of suffering, not being healing, but just not feeling, is something that sometimes I encounter. So I think it seems a lot more helpful to think of the two paths as not two. And watching how things unfold for people is sometimes a challenge and a joy. You know, come for the liberation, stay for the healing. Or come for the liberation, come for the healing and stay for the liberation. Right? They are often combined and they can work together. And I was surprised. I listened to a talk that Kokyo gave on this topic, and Kokyo said that he thinks that practice, Zen practice, is perhaps 80% or so healing and 20% liberation. I don't know why that surprised me so much, but Kokyo is always emphasizing, kind of this clarity of mind, awareness, pure awareness. And he said, I practice sometimes, in the same period of sitting, those things in that proportion, kind of like, oh, that conversation went sideways. I really regret that. Maybe I should do something to heal, that breach. That's what he means by, in this case, by healing. And then he can settle into this kind of clarity. So he actually attends to these kinds of feelings without trying to push them away. He says, accept them, see them for what they are, and then let them go. But there's a little processing that goes along. And if I'm honest about my own Zazen, that happens a lot. I sit down and something arises and I think, oh, great. Or I think, oh, yeah, no, I've got to do something about that. And then maybe from that place of stability, when I get up off the cushion, I know better what to do. He also suggests, Kokyo, that perhaps the path of healing preceded liberation for our ancestors. Although they don't speak of it that way, we don't hear this so much, but that in fact is what they must have, or what he thinks they actually experienced. The ancestors don't remark on it, but Zazen teaches us to be with our experience as part of the conditions for realization. emptiness teachings are maybe not so helpful if we haven't looked deeply into our experience and accepted it. And so Kokyo then gives some instructions. He says, first, really feel the things that are heartache, that are painful, and settle with them in the present, and then intentionally shift into inquiry. Who is this who's feeling these things? Don't manipulate experience. Don't tell ourselves that it's all empty, that nothing really matters, which is another thing that people sometimes think. Don't bypass our experience. So the healing or liberation may sometimes be a little elusive, but we can be seduced by liberation. And here, again, I'm reminded of Reb. He doesn't want to reduce our suffering. He wants to liberate us from it. So one more Tibetan teacher, and then I'll try to summarize. This is a teacher that actually, in a book that actually Gela Roshi showed me, and I have read most of. And she's here in Houston, Anne Carolyn Klein, also known as Lama Ring, I'm going to butcher this, sorry, Lama Rinzin Droma. And the book is Being Human and a Buddha Too. And she, at one point in this book, says, looking into the face of your own heated experience takes courage, as well as wisdom and creativity. She says it means looking right at it without denying, embellishing, judging, or rewriting. I do that a lot, rewriting the raw experience. Above all, without handing over our sense of identity to that experience. You simply feel it, pleasant or unpleasant, or neutral. And she points out that Dzogchen practice, which is often compared to Zen practice, a Tibetan practice, she says that nothing you sense is ever outside your own experience or your own nature. And that feels like liberation to me. She says, your own sheer awareness. Can these experiences be separated from your awareness of them? And if not, does recognizing this make it easier to feel less alienated from your experience? And then she says, ultimately, pain and happiness both arise through the natural dynamism of knowing itself. You can hear kind of Kokyo in this, his Tibetan practices. The natural dynamism of knowing itself. And I like this image. When two waves arise in the same body of water, does it make sense to acknowledge one and not the other? Once we lean into knowing as such, we take a big step towards seeing how all experience arising from our field of sheer knowing, all experiences are in fact identical in nature. It doesn't mean that we don't treat them differently or meet them differently. You might surf one wave and not the other. But unlike in the case of the ordinary choosing mind, we don't see these as fundamentally different. So this knowing itself, which is also an emphasis of Kokyo's teaching, seems to me to be helpful. And I think, again, that we can maybe use some of these teachings in our Zazen. So, our experience is not what we think it is. It's actually ungraspable. And misperception of our experience can be very subtle and very hard to perceive. Also manipulation of our experience, especially when we are off the cushion. But we can still work towards just accepting everything, right, and use both paths. Until we get a taste of this kind of liberation and healing, we can be really uncomfortable in our lives. But the more we stick with it and trust our practice and our experience, and also our Sangha and our teachers, and to generate some curiosity rather than judgment about what we really are, who we really are, we're on the way. And I've been reading recently a book by another teacher, Joan Sutherland, on koan practice, which I'm not really familiar with because it's not been part of my training. But I like koans and I read them. And I try to understand them or at least meet them. And she says this: if in the beginning we are pushed by the urgency of our discomfort, the beginning of our practice, over time we're also pulled by something that becomes more compelling. She says, in my experience, it's not enough to hate suffering, either your own or others. Maybe I wouldn't use the word hate, but that's her word. She says, for awakening to deepen itself, there has to be something you love, something that you want to keep faith with, something you're entirely willing to be vulnerable to be afraid of. So for her, healing is a kind of reciprocity. She speaks about the great sutra of being, the great sutra of the universe, that's fraying sometimes and needs mending, that we mend the great sutra and we are mended by the great sutra. We are made whole. We are mended in turn. You know, we're like unfinished stories. We're already forgiven, as Katagiri Roshi says. All beings are completely forgiven for living their lives. So we can be free and at peace. And I think the true path of healing is not lowering your blood pressure with meditation, although that can be great. Mine dropped 20 points in the first year. But true liberation from our small selves that comes seeking relief and finding it in the great wholeness to which we belong. Thank you very much.